Hello and welcome to the last of the second set of audio presentations for week 2. This is Dr. Melissa Olt, your instructor. In the last presentation, I described a lesson that I wrote and taught on process writing for an ESL composition course. As I mentioned previously, the lesson was written several years ago, so it was not designed with the 20 principles described in Chapter 4 of our textbook explicitly in mind. That being the case, I think we can see at least some of those principles at work in that lesson. So let's take a moment to quickly walk through those principles listed in Table 4.1 in your textbook and see how the lesson I described aligns with them. The first principle listed in Table 4.1 is frequency. Several of the first 8 principles apply to a language course as a whole, so I will only address the ones that are relevant at the lesson or activity level. The first one to consider is strategies and autonomy. In the lesson described, students had to take responsibility for their own errors. When faced with communication breakdown, that is another group not being able to understand how to perform the trick, students had to take responsibility for those errors. They had to learn on their own how to clarify, how to explain. They worked with their peers to overcome vocabulary and structural issues. Through the process, they learned firsthand the importance of writing clearly. Motivation is another principle. In this lesson, students were highly motivated. They were able to practice the target language while engaged in an activity that was simply fun to do. 4 strands. Although this principle applies to the course as a whole, the lesson did demonstrate a fairly balanced use of those 4 strands. Comprehensible input. The lesson clearly required students to practice listening and reading skills. They had to listen to the oral directions given by the instructor at the beginning, and they had to read the instructions given to them by their fellow classmates. It also worked in fluency. The lesson design provided an opportunity for students to increase fluency in language that they already knew. Output. The activity described pushed students to practice the target language in speaking and writing as well. They had to explain orally, they had to clarify what they had written that was confusing, and they also had to write. Both of those are expressive skills. Deliberate learning. The activity provided students the opportunity to learn new and interesting vocabulary as well as to practice spelling and grammar. The time on task. The entire activity was spent engaging students in the active use of the target language, both receptively and expressively, as already explained. The depth of processing. The activity provided students opportunities to think deeply about the task given and apply what they have learned. Integrative motivation. The task at hand was unique, and it helped students to create favorable attitudes as well as provided built-in mechanisms for success. Students were able to get clarification. they were able to improve their writing as the process went along. Learning styles. The lesson addressed many learning styles, including auditory, visual, tactile, and kinesthetic. Students were able to listen to the instructor explain how to do the magic trick and watch the demonstration. Students were able to manipulate the props themselves and move around the room. The lesson also appealed to students who thrive in a group environment. And finally, feedback. Students received multiple kinds of feedback. First, they received oral feedback when they were asked to clarify the directions that they wrote. They also received written feedback from each group that attempted to follow their directions. Finally, they received feedback on the drafts from me, their instructor. The feedback received from their peers was formative, meaning that they could make immediate changes for improvement, as well as summative. They received a final grade from me. And what was the reaction to this lesson? This was by far the most fun and successful class I ever taught. The students were fully engaged, and I had fun watching them work with each other to accomplish the task. They were highly motivated because they also learned a few magic tricks to take home with them and to amaze their friends. Was there any downside? Sure, the students were just a little fatigued after having completed 4 rounds. In retrospect, I would have only required them to swap directions with perhaps one other group, 2 at the most. In closing, I hope that you have found these 2 presentations interesting, and I challenge you to pick your favorite lesson and see how it aligns with the principles outlined in Chapter 4. Thanks, and this concludes